The summer air in Villisca was thick with the scent of lilacs and newly turned earth. June 9, 1912, was a Sunday that dawned clear and warm, the sky so blue it hurt the eyes. Church bells rang through the town, a call to faith that most obeyed without question. Inside the Moore house, the day was filled with laughter and bustle. Josiah Moore, known to his friends as Joe, wore his stiff-collared white shirt, brushing specks of dust from his Sunday suit. His wife, Sarah, fussed over the children's hair, smoothing partings and tucking stray locks behind ears. Their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, scurried about underfoot, half excited, half bored by the promise of a long evening at the Presbyterian Children's Day program. Guests were coming too. Lena and Ina Stillinger, the neighbor girls, arrived with shy smiles and freshly scrubbed faces, their hair tied back with matching blue ribbons. They had accepted Sarah Moore's invitation to sleep over, sparing themselves the late walk home in the dark. After church, the families exchanged gossip under the June sun, words buzzing like flies over picnic tables. No one suspected that by dawn, all 8 souls in the Moore house would lie butchered in their beds. When the evening program ended around 9:30, the Moores and the Stillinger girls walked home in the dark, the glow of kerosene lamps shining from tidy farmhouses along the road. Joe carried little Paul on his shoulder. Sarah kept the girls close, offering a protective arm as the grass rustled on either side of them. The only sounds were crickets, their steady scrape like a saw blade in the night, and the far-off hoot of an owl. The Moore house sat on the edge of town, a white clapboard structure with gingerbread trim. When they entered, the children shuffled off shoes and stockings, giggling as Sarah shushed them. Upstairs, they tumbled into beds while Joe doused the lamp. Outside, the wind fell still. The town slept. But in the pitch-black attic of the Moore house, someone waited. The intruder had slipped in earlier, unnoticed, hidden himself behind stacked trunks and broken chairs. He held his breath as he listened to the family's return. The scrape of the door latch, muffled conversation, the hush of children falling asleep. His eyes adjusted to the gloom. He could see cracks in the floorboards, moonlight seeping through them. He watched. He listened. Hours passed. When the house was silent at last, utterly silent, he eased open the attic door. Downstairs, the clock ticked. He took the axe. He gripped the axe handle so tightly his knuckles whitened, feeling the smooth, worn wood. He moved carefully, placing each footfall with excruciating care. The floor creaked once, a high, thin sound. He paused, listening. No one stirred. He descended the narrow staircase, shadows flowing around him like water. The only light was a dull silver rectangle of moonlight cast through the window. He kept to its edges, breathing slowly. Upstairs, Joe and Sarah slept in their bed, unaware. He stopped outside their door. Listened. A faint snore. He pushed the door open with a slow, patient pressure until it swung fully inward. He entered, silhouetted for a moment against the window. Joe shifted in his sleep but didn't wake. Sarah's hair fanned over her pillow. He raised the axe. The blade came down with a sickening, wet crunch. Joe didn't even cry out, just a ragged gurgle. Sarah jerked awake, her mouth opening in a silent scream. He struck again and again until her face was a ruin of blood and bone. The room stank of iron. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of red. He turned and moved to the children's room. Herman was first, just 12 years old, caught in the confusion of half-waking terror. He managed a short, strangled no before the axe caved in his skull. Catherine sat up, screaming, but the killer was fast. He struck her, again and again, until the cries fell silent. Boyd and little Paul barely stirred. They died quickly, their small forms broken in the tangle of quilts. The killer stopped. He breathed heavily, listening to the house. The wind rattled the windows. A dog barked far away. No one had heard them. Down the narrow hall, the guest room waited. Lena and Ina Stillinger lay side by side in their borrowed bed. The killer stepped in quietly. Lena's eyes opened. She saw the silhouette of the man, the axe raised. She kicked, scrambling away. The blade caught her thigh, slicing muscle. She let out a scream that was quickly cut short as the axe fell again, this time on her face, splitting it nearly in two. Ina whimpered, rolling over. But the killer was relentless. He crushed her skull with 2 precise, wet blows. When it was finished, he stood over the bed, panting, the axe slick and dripping. He listened. Silence. Blood pooled on the floorboards, seeping into the grain. He wiped the axe on the blankets, smearing long streaks of gore. Then, methodically, he covered the Stillinger girls' faces with a bedsheet. He moved back through the house, covering the Moore children with clothing or sheets, hiding their ruined features from sight, as though the act had suddenly shamed him. In the parents' room, he laid a piece of gauze over Joe's shattered face. He even draped Sarah's blood-soaked nightgown over her remains. When he was done, he went to the kitchen. He washed his hands in the basin, the water turning pink, then red. He wiped the axe clean again. He poured himself a glass of milk, drank it, set the glass carefully on the table, and then he left. Into the night. He closed the door softly behind him. No one saw him go. The sun rose over Villisca with a golden calm that belied the horror sealed behind the white clapboard walls of the Moore residence. The streets were quiet, dust kicking up in soft gusts as milkmen began their rounds and farmers hitched their wagons. But at the house on 508 East 2nd Street, nothing stirred. No one emerged to greet the day, no voices, no clatter of breakfast dishes, just the still, dead silence of a home holding its breath. It was around 7:30 a.m. when Mary Peckham, the Moores' elderly neighbor, noticed the odd stillness. Sarah Moore was usually up early tending to the wash, her children already giggling in the yard or calling out across the picket fence. But that morning, the curtains remained drawn. No one came outside. Mary frowned. She stepped onto her porch, wiped her hands on her apron, and called over the fence. "Sarah? Joe?" No answer. She walked across the lawn, tapping gently on the front door. Still nothing. A chill prickled up her neck. She moved to the back door and knocked again, harder this time. Then, with hesitation and a quiet mutter of "forgive me," she tried the handle. Locked. Her unease deepened. She walked back to her house and called Ross Moore, Joe's brother. By 8:15, Ross arrived with his key. He didn't knock. Something in Mary's face told him everything he needed to know. He turned the key slowly and stepped inside. The air hit him immediately, thick, metallic, unnatural, a heaviness that clung to his skin. "Joe?" he called into the darkened hallway. No reply. He stepped forward, past the parlor, into the downstairs guest room, and froze. What he saw would never leave him. The bed was soaked in blood, the sheets twisted and red. A girl's arm dangled from the mattress. Her face, unrecognizable, caved in with savage force, was barely visible beneath the sheet. Ross staggered back, retching. He clutched the wall and ran out the door, calling for Mary, shouting for someone, anyone, to get the marshal. Within the hour, Marshal Henry Hank Horton arrived. He entered the house, hand on his revolver, though deep down he knew it wouldn't help. What he found upstairs confirmed every fear. 8 bodies, every one of them bludgeoned beyond recognition, faces destroyed, blood on the walls, on the ceiling, an axe, bloody, abandoned, resting against the wall of the bedroom. Mirrors had been covered with cloth. All the victims' faces had been veiled, some with clothing, some with bedsheets. A slab of bacon, wrapped in cheesecloth, lay on the floor near the axe. Another slab was in the icebox. A lamp had been disassembled to dim the light. Whoever had done this had stayed, had taken their time. Word spread like wildfire. By noon, the street outside was choked with neighbors, onlookers, whispers turning to panic. A line of men stood silently outside the gate, hats clutched in their hands. Women wept openly. Someone said the killer had hidden in the attic. Someone else said the axe had belonged to Joe Moore himself. By sundown, Villisca was no longer a sleepy Iowa town. It was a crime scene, a place of fear, a place of death. And somewhere, out beyond the fields and fences, the killer walked free. The county coroner, Dr. Lindquist, arrived that afternoon with a grim, resigned face. He was no stranger to death, but this was different. The sheriff met him at the gate, tugging at his hat, eyes haunted. "You ready for this, Doc?" Lindquist just nodded, lips pressed to a thin line. Inside, the air was suffocating. The sweet, rotten stench of blood filled every corner. Lindquist's boots stuck slightly to the floorboards where dark patches had seeped in. He examined the bodies one by one, Joe Moore's head was cleaved open so deeply that brain matter was visible, bone shattered like pottery. Sarah's face was a pulp of flesh and teeth. The children hadn't been spared an ounce of the killer's fury. Boyd's skull was split nearly in two. Even little Paul's bedding was soaked and sticky with blood. In the guest room, the Stillinger girls had clearly fought. Lena had defensive wounds on her arm, a savage gash across her thigh, her nightgown rucked up around her waist. Lindquist noted it carefully in his pad, though he couldn't bear to look long. Ina lay beside her, her head unrecognizable. He found the killer's odd ritualistic touches deeply disturbing. The covered faces, the disassembled lamp with the chimney placed carefully under the dresser, the slab of bacon, greasy and wrapped in cloth. He shook his head, voice low. This wasn't just murder, he muttered to the sheriff. This was personal or insane. The sheriff swallowed hard. They tried to keep people out of the house, but Villisca was a small town, and curiosity is stronger than fear. By mid-afternoon, dozens of townsfolk had come in to see. Boots tramped through blood, people whispered in horror, some even touched the axe. Contamination meant little back then, but the scene was ruined before a real investigation could even begin. Outside, the air buzzed with talk. Who would do such a thing? Had to be a stranger. No one from here would. They say the killer waited in the attic all night, just listening. Children were pulled close by their mothers. Doors were locked that had never been locked before. Windows shuttered. By sunset, the coroner's wagon rolled away with the 8 small shrouded forms. Ross Moore stood on the porch, face pale, hat in his hands. His brother's blood was drying in the floorboards behind him. He didn't cry. He just shook his head. God help us, he whispered. News spread beyond Villisca almost instantly. Reporters arrived by train the next morning. Flashbulbs popped as they photographed the house, the yard, the gathered crowd. The Des Moines Register ran the headline. 8 slaughtered in Villisca. Whole family and 2 guests murdered in their sleep. But no one had any answers. The town held its breath, waiting for the next blow. And somewhere the man with the axe was still breathing too. Rumors spread through Villisca like wildfire licking dry grass. People gathered in tight knots on porches, in the general store, at the train depot, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They say the killer was hiding in the attic all night, watching them, listening to the kids laugh before bed. Like an animal. Fear rooted deep in every heart. This wasn't a killing in some far-off city. It was here, in their quiet town, a place where doors had never needed locks. Now, hardware stores sold out of them in a day. Sheriff Jackson and Marshal Horton tried to keep order, but their faces showed they were shaken. They questioned neighbors, examined every stranger stepping off the trains. Drifters, peddlers, even traveling ministers were eyed with suspicion. They had no real suspects. A traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly drew attention early on. Eccentric, known for ranting sermons, he'd been at the Children's Day service the night of the murders. He left town at dawn by train. Witnesses said he acted odd, asking people if they'd heard about the murders before anyone officially knew. But no one saw him with blood on his clothes. No one could prove he'd been in the house. Others pointed fingers at Frank Jones, a prominent businessman and state senator. Joe Moore had once worked for him. Some said he'd stolen a big account, and worse, that he'd been too friendly with Jones's daughter-in-law. The rumor was Jones hired a killer, but no proof ever surfaced. Soon every theory sounded plausible. Some said the killer was a stranger who hopped a freight train after the murders. Others whispered it was someone in Villisca itself, a man you'd nod to on the street, a man who smiled and said good morning. The funeral was held in town with all 8 caskets lined in a row. Hundreds attended. Women wept behind handkerchiefs. Men removed their hats and stared at the ground. Ross Moore stood with his wife, face hard as granite. They deserved better, he said hoarsely. The children's teacher sobbed openly, recalling their laughter, their drawings. Preachers railed from pulpits about sin and evil stalking the land. But the sermons offered little comfort. When night fell on Villisca, it was darker than it had ever been. Families barred doors, wedged chairs under knobs, sat up with shotguns across their laps. Children huddled under quilts, asking their mothers in small, trembling voices if the axeman would come for them next. Outside, the cicadas sang in the tall grass, And in the Morehouse, now silent, the blood long dried in its cracks, the wind sighed through empty rooms. No one would live there for years. They said it was haunted. People said they heard things in that house at night. Low footsteps across the upstairs floorboards. A child's muffled cry quickly silenced. The dull, sickening thunk of an axe hitting flesh. Neighbors swore they saw a pale light drift past the windows long after the house was abandoned. Teenagers dared each other to run up to the porch and touch the door. Few had the nerve to cross the threshold. Those who did claimed the air inside was ice cold even in the sweltering Iowa summer. But ghosts weren't the only thing haunting Villisca. The investigation dragged on for years with no resolution. The coroner's inquest turned into a public spectacle. Witness after witness offered scraps of suspicion, nothing solid. The jury couldn't even agree on whether it was a single killer or two. When Reverend Kelly returned months later, drawn by some twisted fascination, he confessed. Sort of. He said God told him to do it. He described the killings in detail. But then he recanted, claiming he'd been beaten, threatened, tricked. His lawyers called it a false confession from a mentally ill man. In 1917, he went to trial. The courtroom was packed with people hungry for justice. They wanted to see a killer hanged. But the evidence was paper-thin. No eyewitnesses, no blood-stained clothes, no motive anyone could prove. After a long, tense deliberation, the jury deadlocked. A retrial was called, and Reverend Kelly walked free. Villisca's hopes for closure died that day. Rumors of other suspects kept surfacing for decades. A traveling serial killer with a pattern of axe murders across the Midwest. A paid assassin hired by a jealous rival. Someone local who smiled and shook your hand in church. No one was ever convicted. The house sat empty. Dust collected in the corners. Wind moaned through its seams. Children dared each other to peek through its windows and swore they saw blood on the walls. In time, it became legend. A place where evil had stayed the night. A place that remembered. Decades passed, but Villisca never truly moved on. The town tried to forget. The house was rented out, sold, abandoned, reclaimed. Families who stayed there reported nightmares, cold spots, voices in the dark. Some fled in the middle of the night, refusing to return even for their belongings. Older townsfolk would lower their voices when you asked. Best leave that house alone. In the end, it stood as a kind of monument, not to a killer caught and punished, but to fear itself. They called it cursed. They turned it into a museum eventually. Guides walked visitors through the cramped rooms, telling the story in hushed, reverent tones. Here's the axe. Here's where they slept. Here's where they died. People claimed to hear whispers in the children's room. Lights flickered without reason. Ghost hunters came with cameras and recorders, sure they'd capture proof of restless spirits. Some swore they did. But you didn't need a ghost to feel haunted there. Because the truth was worse than any specter. No one ever answered for what happened. The killer got away. He might have died peacefully in bed decades later, or sat in church every Sunday after the murders, singing hymns with the same lips that once smiled at the blood spraying from an axe. That was the part that chilled you deepest in Villisca. Not that the house was haunted, but that the evil in it had been human, and that it had never really left. If you found this story as haunting as I did, hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these mysteries. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime and unsolved horror every single week.